a siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water? Sir Keir?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself.
Today is one of those days where I naively dream of not being accused simultaneously of rancid anti-Semitism and having the blood of Palestinian children on my hands. By, I imagine, 10:30 today, my inbox will be pinging with both of those ridiculous assertions, which is an indication perhaps of how hard it is to conduct this conversation, and also perhaps of why we don't do it as often as we should. I think sometimes that the accusations of anti-Semitism are designed to stop us talking about it, and I think that the accusations of having the blood of Palestinian children on your hands are not. I think that, but although equally ludicrous, I think the motivation for those responses is actually different, but that perhaps is a little bit moot for current purposes. I believe now, for the avoidance of any doubt whatsoever, that the actions of Israel, of the Israeli Defense Force in the Gaza Strip, became, at a point in the recent past that I cannot precisely pinpoint, became unconscionable, became obscene. It is for judges and courts to decide whether or not they have become genocidal, but the idea that pursuing some 20,000 terrorists somehow justifies the dislocation and destruction of some 2 million lives and the killing of almost 40,000 humans, mostly women and children, is absolutely inconceivable, the notion of justification. Philosophically, ethically, the problem is that after the October the 7th terror attack, there was a clear and, to me at least, inarguable need for Israel to respond robustly. I mean, the worse the response becomes, the more I wonder whether that was the right opinion to hold at the time. But anybody who thinks that what is happening now and what has happened since that unspecified moment at which it became, quotes, too much, end quotes, or disproportionate, anybody defending that is complicit in mass murder, in my view, or is at least supporting it. Which brings us to the British government. I want to play you an interview that Jonathan Ashworth has given in the last few hours, an interview in which he describes some of the experiences he had while losing his seat to a political opponent in Leicester South, campaigning more or less exclusively on the issue of Gaza. Just have a little listen to this before we proceed.
I've never known a campaign of such vitriol, such bullying, such intimidation. I've never seen a Member of Parliament, shocker Adam Patel, get elected on the basis of a foul and obnoxious lie that I was responsible for genocide, that I had the blood of Gazan children on my hands. This was his campaign. I had his supporters bullying and intimidating myself and my key supporters in the streets, and he refuses to condemn it. He's actually gone to ground and he's refusing to answer any questions on this. It's very disrespectful to the people of Leicester South that he's disappeared. But look, there should be no place for bullying and intimidation in politics. And some people have said, oh, don't speak out, it looks like sour grapes. I'm a northern lad. I'm from a different bit of Greater Manchester than you, but we were taught to stand up to bullies. And that's what I'll always do. OK, and you have gone on record to say that some of his supporters are questionable. Well, yeah, well, there's now a legal case, so we perhaps ought to... Tiptoe through that, but that in itself, I think, tells you something. OK, well, a spokesman for... a spokesperson, MP, not even him, yeah. A spokesperson. Yeah. Why can't he answer questions? Why isn't he sat here asking questions? We'll try. Shawkat was elected by a diverse coalition of voters in Leicester South. He's focused on delivering for his constituents and will not be distracted by sour grapes from a beaten rival whose divisive politics were resoundingly rejected at the ballot box. He is focusing on keeping his head down and running away from scrutiny. He should be sat in this chair answering simple, straightforward questions about the conduct of his campaign. But look, it is what it is now. He's won. I think he's already letting down the people of Leicester South, and he won't be able to deliver change. The improvements in Leicester South to our National Health Service, to the cost of living, to our schools, will be because of a Labour government, not an impotent, independent opposition MP. But we've got to speak up against this intimidation. It wasn't just me. You saw brilliant women like Shabana Mahmood, Jess Phillips, intimidated and barracked. They stood up to the bullies, and I'm so pleased that those two women, who are absolutely excellent MPs, are in a Labour government.
Well, of course, we've asked for him to come on the...
And the reference that Jonathan Ashworth makes obliquely there is to a man who celebrated the victory of Shocker Adam over Jonathan Ashworth in Leicester South, being charged overnight with a terrorism offence. He mentioned Jess Phillips and Shabana Mahmood. Let's have a little listen to what happened at the count, the announcement of the result in Jess Phillips's constituency of Birmingham Yardley.
Phillips, Jessica Rose, known as Jess Phillips, Labour Party, 11,275. Total number of rejected ballot papers is 120. Excuse me. Thank you. Number of rejected ballot papers is 128. This represents a majority of 693, with a turnout of 49.5%. I therefore do hereby declare that Phillips Jessica Rose, known as Jess Phillips, is duly elected as the Member of Parliament for Birmingham Yardley constituency.
Well, a very close thing for Jess Phillips.
11 minutes after 10, as you can tell, we borrowed that coverage from the BBC, for which we're very grateful, of course. So there's something that needs to be stated fairly explicitly. It is absolutely obscene to accuse Labour politicians of being complicit in genocide or having blood on their hands, because even if the Labour Party in opposition had called for Benjamin Netanyahu to be put on trial in The Hague last week, it wouldn't have made the blindest bit of difference to anything. So feelings run extremely high, obviously. But those accusations are more about, I think, sometimes the self-righteousness of the accuser than they are about the culpability of the accused. However, Keir Starmer's challenge now is to do something meaningful in power that he could not have done in opposition. And he's already made it clear that he is committed to a two-state solution. He has already called for a ceasefire, and he has already stressed the importance of retaining a relationship with the State of Israel. I don't know if it's possible to do all three of those things. I really don't. But I know that he has to try. So there are two questions here. How big a problem is Gaza for the Labour government? To which the answer is, I think, not very big, actually, in the context of politics, in the context of domestic politics. They lost a couple of seats, and they came very close to losing a couple more. Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips, both very, very close to being toppled by a pro-Gaza activist. And I don't use that as a pejorative. I think that's a helpful and a simple statement. But what he can do as Prime Minister, of course, cannot be cloaked or camouflaged in the language of impotence. He is no longer impotent. Or is he? I mean, he can call for a ceasefire until he's blue in the face. So what should the Labour government policy towards Israel regarding Gaza be? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. I don't know what question to ask you to dig into the actions of the kind of people intimidating Jess Phillips or bullying Jonathan Ashworth on the streets of Leicester South. I mean, it doesn't go back to the ceasefire, by the way. It doesn't go back to Keir Starmer's deeply unfortunate comments on this radio station, which he tried at least to very, very quickly clarify and withdraw. But I'm afraid they were halfway around the world before the clarifications and withdrawals had got their trousers on about Israel somehow having the right to withhold electricity and water from Gaza, which would, as he would know as a lawyer, be an absolute definition of a war crime. I can tell you, for example, in Leicester South, that someone who campaigned there in 2004 describes to me, in a private note, voter intimidation that was enormous. A Liberal Democrat candidate who was a Sikh won, but it was a vitriolic campaign largely aimed at Labour. So it's certainly not linked exclusively to the current crisis in Gaza, the current carnage in Gaza, or the failure of Labour to call quickly enough in the eyes of many people for a ceasefire. But what you have in place now is an explicit call for a ceasefire from Israel and an explicit commitment from Keir Starmer to a two-state solution for the Palestinian people. And that question that hangs over all of this now then is, what do you want him to do? And I ask this, it doesn't happen very often, I ask this in the hope that you will say something to me that makes me think, yes, that is now my opinion. That is now my opinion. What do you want Keir Starmer to do? Because, let me read you this from Richard. You are a rabid anti-Semite. What's the name of the hostage negotiation team that claims the hostages would have been released? Or is it an anonymous quote from an extreme left-wing page? Yada, 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 yada. And equally, here's one from Lee. You obviously still believe that there is such a thing as an innocent Palestinian. So you have all of that going on. There will always be people who are not prepared to admit in any conceivable way that the people being killed in Gaza are innocent. And that, of course, is the rationale under which genocides can happen. But what the British government can do is a question that needs to be properly addressed, because you've got two stools here. You've got people like our friends Richard and Lee there, who are essentially either sitting on their hands or cheering possible genocide. And then you've got, at the other extreme, people like the ones accusing Jonathan Ashworth of somehow having Palestinian blood on his hands, when there was literally nothing substantive or meaningful that these people could have done to stay Netanyahu's hand. So you take those two ludicrous extremes, you acknowledge importantly that it is their vitriol and their bigotry that actually closes down the conversation. You ask yourself, do they want the conversation to be closed down, or do they not realize that their vitriol and bigotry is closing down the conversation? And we will have different answers, I suspect, to that question. But you have to recognize that lives are saved according to dialogue. And if we are not having these conversations, we are not having these dialogues, then we are, I guess, implicitly waving through a continuation of the carnage. Now, some people want that, like our friends Richard and Lee. They want more dead Palestinian people. They want more dead brown children. But for those of us who don't, what is Keir Starmer supposed to do now? 0345 6060 I'll push you a little bit. I'll try my very best not to be brusque or short-tempered on this, but it does take a toll being accused of things like that. Obviously it does. But it has to be something meaningful. It has to, I think, now that he's in power, because this was what was used to defend him when he was in opposition. He can't do anything because he's not in power. So it has to be something meaningful. It has to be something substantive. It has to be something that is likely to change the game. And I'm going to tell you at 10:18 what my cautious opinion is at this point. Cautious opinion. And it's pessimistic and it's heartbreaking. But in the context of somehow stopping Netanyahu from continuing to kill Palestinian people, I don't think there's anything that Keir Starmer can do. And if that's true, I wonder how helpful it would be for him to admit that. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. What should the UK government policy be? You've got to get used to this. It's not Labour Party. It's not opinions expressed in opposition or votes cast because of parliamentary arithmetic and the SNP. All of that's in the past. This is Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He's called explicitly for a ceasefire. He has committed himself publicly to a two-state solution. And yet He has got a slightly denuded cabinet at the moment as a direct consequence. His culture secretary and I forget what Jonathan Ashworth's brief was. They are not in his cabinet because there are people in British constituencies who succeeded in peddling the propaganda, I think, to be kind, that they somehow bear personal responsibility for the continuing carnage in Gaza. That's how I see it. I could be wrong. I sometimes am. All right. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. What do you want your government's policy to be? All right. And remember, this is not necessarily a question that demands contributions informed by the continuing carnage. Perhaps you want the carnage to continue. You think there is no choice but for Israel to continue to kill innocent women and children, to drop missiles on schools and hospitals and the rest of it, because either you've swallowed the idea that they're all secretly full of terrorists, and the reason why Israel won't let independent journalists in to actually find out for themselves is perfectly reasonable and plausible. That position is one that I'd like to be explored, but probably not in snarky texts from WhatsApp accounts. I'd quite like it to be done in the daylight.